welcome to a special edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin, on CGTN, and this is a special roundtable discussion leading up to the 19th National Congress of the Communist Party of China. Now, since the 18th National Congress of the Communist Party of China 5 years ago, the CPC Central Committee, with Xi Jinping as its core, has firmly promoted major country diplomacy with distinctive Chinese features. What does that all mean? Now, the approach is based on win-win cooperation and the building of a community of shared destiny. How can we better understand these terms, and what will be the highlights in diplomacy for the next 5 years for China? This is our discussion today, and I'm very pleased to be joined by Mr. Jeff Raby, former Australian ambassador to China from 2007 to 2011. As usual, our old friend, Dr. Victor Gao, interpreter for the late Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping, and last but not least, Harvey Zoding, a non-resident research fellow of the Center for China and Globalization. Gentlemen, welcome very much to the show.
Thank you.
Very interesting discussion, but before we start this discussion, I would like to show some statistics, to share some of the interesting statistics that we have found out. For instance, in terms of diplomacy, Chinese President Xi Jinping, together with Chinese diplomats, have been extremely busy, and we just, looked on the internet and see how many visits, for instance, they did over the past 5 years, and here are some statistics. Let's take a look. Over the years of over 5 years, 28 visits, 570,000 kilometers. By the way, 570,000 kilometers, that's like 14 times around the globe. The total number of the total amount of time he spent abroad is 193 days. He went to all 5 continents, visited 56 countries and international organizations. So indeed, very, very busy schedule. But again, that is just Chinese diplomatic efforts outside of China. Again, we had many diplomatic activities inside China, and here are some chats. For instance, in 2014, we had the APEC meeting in Beijing. I believe you might all remember a little bit. In 2016, we had the G20 in the Chinese city of Hangzhou. This year alone, we had 2 big events, which is the Belt and Road Summit, the Belt and Road Forum, and the BRICS Summit, which just wrapped up in Xiamen. So very, very busy, a lot of trips, a lot of events. Gentlemen, why is China so busy on the diplomatic front?
I think it's because for many years China was just, as Deng Xiaoping said, hiding China's strength and biding their time. But China's time is now, because China's become a very powerful country, and it was not present when the current world order was established. But now China wants to have a seat at the table to make the rules and to be a leader, which it should be by virtue of the fact that it's grown up considerably since New China was established.
Mm-hmm. Well, Deng Xiaoping's name was mentioned. Victor Gao, you have a lot to say here. You accompanied, right, Chinese leader, making visits overseas, making speeches on international arena. What were the characteristics back then, and what have you observed over the past 5 years that are particularly different?
I think the world we are living in, especially the world during the past 5 years, is changing rapidly, and there are profound implications, and the world today needs China's role much more so than before. And by now, China is already the 2nd largest economy, the largest economy by purchasing power parity. China is the largest manufacturing country, is the largest trading nation. Therefore, in the economic and trade sectors, China's influence is expanding very, very rapidly. Many countries in the world find it mutually beneficial to engage China as a trading partner. On the political arena, China's role as a stabilizing force in the world today is extremely important. And
back then, when Deng Xiaoping was leading China, his famous theory was to hide your strength, right? To stay low-key and avoid being in the spotlight on the front row. Has China really, flipped around and, be at the very line?
I don't think so. I think the philosophy of Tao Guang Yang Hui, basically do not be abrasive, for example, or steal the spotlight on any given occasion, still applies to China. And Tao Guang Yang Hui not only applies to China, it applies to many other countries or very outstanding statesmen in the world, even today, for example. And I don't think the rest of the world will welcome a China which is very abrasive, for example, which is always pushing itself onto the center of the stage, like some other world leaders did recently, for example. They would like to have a China which is more peaceful with itself, peaceful with the rest of the world, respects the other countries, and treat the other countries as an equal, as brothers and sisters. And whenever there is a problem, China should be eager to talk it over, to negotiate, to engage in diplomacy, rather than sending the Marine, for example, or the gunboats. And I think Tao Guang Yang Hui, or don't become abrasive and push yourself onto the center of the stage, probably will remain a characteristic of the Chinese diplomacy for decades to come.
Yeah, Ambassador Raby, was that your observation, that China has always stayed a key low profile while you were serving as ambassador, Australian ambassador in China, and ever since? Has there been maybe subtle changes?
I think the changes have been quite profound in the way China conducts its foreign policy, with full respect to Victor. I think you saw in the latter years of the previous leadership, China adopting a more assertive stance on foreign policy. You saw it, for example, sending the PLA Navy to Somalia to join the international action to stem piracy in the region. And that's the first time, I think, the PLA Navy had gone beyond China's shores. And it was a multilateral effort, but still, for China to be involved in that way. And following that, China's been quite active in UN peacekeeping, Somalia, on land, throughout Africa. We've seen a much more assertive Chinese foreign policy in the region. And certainly South China Sea is seen by regional neighbours as China being more assertive. I think the question is what's going on, and I think Harvey, very accurately summed it up, that China's time has arrived. It no longer will follow the policy of keeping a low profile whilst it builds its strength. For 30 years in the reform period, China focused almost entirely on economic development and building its own economy. But as Victor said, it's now, in purchasing power parity terms, the biggest economy in the world. And it's only natural that a country of China's size will be more assertive and more engaged internationally, not only to protect its interests, but as Harvey said, to try and reshape an international order which was established in 1949 at the end of the Second World War. Today, the weight of world economic power is in this region, and China sits at the center of that phenomenon.
Yeah, well, I think it's a very difficult position, right? It's a very delicate dance, if I can put it this way. You have a huge weight, but you have to tread a very delicate line to not to be overly assertive, because very easily you can become perceived as such, right? For instance, in the South China Sea issue, a lot of people are basically assuming that because China is big, it must be bullying its neighbors, which are, just by nature smaller. How do you look at this difficulty in handling this major power diplomacy in an emerging stage?
To me, it's like walking on eggs, because
you can't avoid breaking them. I mean,
right, exactly.
Look,
so
maybe that's not a good metaphor.
but you hope to have enough so you can make an omelet at the end of the day. So I think it is a balance, and it's a hard balance to keep. But China has to do that because many people are rightly or wrongly suspicious of China. They're concerned when they think about the Chinese dream, which I believe is what's driving a lot of these activities. The fact that the president and the country wants to reassert itself and to rejuvenate the Chinese nation. I mean, what amazes me is I've lived in China for long enough to know what 99.9% of Americans, for instance, don't know, is that China was the it nation, the great nation for a millennium. And it was only during this century of humiliation that China did not have that position. So it's trying to get back to where it was. But Americans, if they know anything, maybe they go back to World War II, and that's about it. So you have to also put it in a context. China is trying to get back to where it was, but hopefully in a way that's with 21st century thinking.
But I think the difficulty is people simply do not believe or do not buy the Chinese proposal, let's say, that even when we are big, even when we are back to where we were, we will not seek expansionism, we will not be bullying others, we will not exercise hegemony. For me, that is a question, you know, we cannot argue, because how can you say, I will not bully you, because only time will tell, right? But on the other hand, China has never done that, and China has vowed again and again not to do that. So, Victor, how can China make itself clearer than it's possible that China does not have the intention to be a hegemonic power?
I remember a phrase made by a former prime minister from Malaysia. He basically said Malaysia is not afraid of China because China came about 600 years ago and never took an inch of the land from Malaysia at that time, whereas many other countries came and they occupied and colonized Malaysia. So from the Malaysians' perspective, according to this former Prime Minister, China is a factor. China has been here. China has a consistent track record. And I hope going forward, China can really make its strategic intentions well known and more transparent to the rest of the world. Apparently, China is a new phenomenon, very, very different from many European powers or from the United States. And in the world today, which is very complicated, the United States is still the strongest military power, and China has no intention of engaging with the United States in a war, for example, or in a confrontation with the United States. But then, in the world today, there are many other countries which feel a little bit split in their mind as to whether, for example, they need to follow the United States politically, militarily, or economically, or whether they need to really engage with China, which is the largest trading partner with more than 120 countries in the world. I hope eventually the world and the rest of the world will find it more comfortable to maintain their relations with the United States politically or militarily, but also fully engage with China on the economic and trade side. China will have no problem with, let's say, Australia being a strong ally of the United States, but the largest trading partner with China.
I think you nailed it, because Australia is a classic example, right, of people saying stuck between a rock and a hard place. Some people see it that way. Ambassador Raby, do you see it that way?
The Australian government says that's not the case, but the reality is, of course, we take our security through our alliance with the United States, and that's fundamental, and that won't change. China is by far Australia's largest trading partner, largest source of foreign students, largest source of tourists. You can just go on and on. And so Australia's economic dependency on China is enormous, and so it's a big challenge for Australian diplomats to manage all of these things in a very dynamic situation. And a dynamic situation has a number of elements. One is China's continued economic growth and rise, which we all embrace and welcome. Also, I think the shifting position of the US in the world, with its distraction in wars in the Middle East, Afghanistan, and also an American population that has changed its view on where America should be in the world and how engaged America should be in the world. This is a chessboard with all the parts in motion. So a country like Australia finds it a very challenging time for our diplomacy. But in principle, there's no reason why there should be a contradiction or a conflict between our security alliance with the United States and our economic arrangements with China, our economic dependency with China. But I should say that I spent a lot of time trying to explain to people in Canberra or Washington or somewhere how the world looks in geopolitical and strategic terms from Beijing, but sometimes you need to say how it looks from Canberra, Washington, to people in Beijing. And the point I'd make is that you cannot just take China's assertions of not being an expansionary power as the basis for a strategic and security policy. No strategic analyst or government could say, oh, well, we just take people at their word because we know what the world is like. So it's important for governments elsewhere in the world to develop strategies to respond to the rise of China, and the question then becomes, what are those strategies? And I think it's naive to just say, well, China has not been expansionary. I mean, after all, the Qing, they weren't Han Chinese, but the Qing were a very expansionary power and occupied...
Not the Han Chinese.
Not the Han Chinese, no.
Okay.
And I made that qualification.
Yes.
But people look at the history.
Sure.
And outside of China, people don't make those subtle distinctions and nuanced statements. So I agree very much with Victor. It's very incumbent upon China to be much more transparent than it has been about its strategic intentions and strategic objectives. And I think that's how you start to really build comfort.
I think China has a big obstacle in doing that, because we can explain as much as we want, or we can be as transparent as we grow, and increasingly, but we are in a disadvantage as well in the media and the international opinion, and working against that tide. You don't think so? Why not?
I just was reading some public opinion data from a long-term perspective of how nations view China's favorability. And America used to be the clear leader in this. China is basically caught up now in terms of favorability, and this is data from Pew Charitable Trust. And even Australia has gone from being more favorable to U.S. to now being more favorable by a significant margin to China. So I think that the world is changing a lot. But one thing I want to say is, if you look at this particular region, most of the countries favor U.S. They're not with the trend. They don't favor China. And I think this is a little bit about what Jeff was saying, that we have to look at deeds and not words. Because I think people are concerned, and your neighbors are concerned here. They're concerned about China's action. They're concerned about the South China Sea. They're concerned about China's position in the Permanent Court of Arbitration and the Philippine decision. So I think that China has to be a little careful, but the bottom line is always going to be deeds.
Dr. Gao?
Well, I think in addition to whatever China has pronounced, we also need to look at what China is really doing. For example, this One Belt, One Road initiative is a new version of economic development paradigm, welcomed by almost 100 countries in the world willing to participate in this initiative. It's not based on gunboat diplomacy, it's not based on military strength, it's based on equality, partnership, cooperation among all the countries, looking at Eurasian continent, looking at Africa, and now spilling over to North America, to Latin America, to probably Australia, New Zealand, etc., so that these countries can really rise up to a new level of analysis, look at economic development on a much larger economic unit, and come up with all the sharing of the resources, sharing of the opportunities, and eventually everyone, every participating country may be better off, because the focus is on connectivity, on infrastructure, on promoting the new version of globalization.
Sure, but even that, people are suspicious. You know, when you talk about Belt and Road, you say it's about development, it's about economic investment opportunity. People are saying, look, it's China's new hegemonic ambition. You know, they want to come in, they want to bring in the troops and all of that. But anyway, why don't we take a listen to what Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi said recently, how he summed up what China has been trying to do over the past 5 years in terms of international diplomacy. Let's take a listen to that.
经过几十年的快速发展，中国当然已经是一个响当当的世界大国，但同时我们又是一个发展中国家。更重要的是我们还是一个坚持共产党领导的社会主义大国。习近平总书记强调的，中国必须有自己特色大国外交，要有鲜明的中国特色、中国风格和中国气派。
Interesting words. First of all, major country diplomacy, and then with Chinese characteristics, Chinese style, and Chinese manner. I wonder how you understand that. Is, for instance, the One Belt, One Road part of the major country diplomacy that China has in its mind?
Yes, indeed. I think there is no doubt that China is a major country. It's one of the largest countries, most important countries on the global scene. And I think the major country diplomacy also very much includes the definition of the common destiny of mankind, which really tries to rise up above, country as a unit of the analysis to regions or to the whole world and to mankind as a whole single entity. And I think if we can all move in that direction and rise up to the level of mankind as a common destiny, then we probably will be in a better position to overcome many of these conflicts, for example, civilizational differences and religious strifes, for example, and then the world can be a better place.
Sure, this is very nice. Very, very bright picture ahead. But again, these are big, huge words, right? I think for the individual person in a foreign country, in Australia, in the United States, or in Africa, what will it mean? China exercising a major country diplomacy, different from any previous style of diplomacy that we know of. What kind of difference would that make to countries, to individuals?
Look, I think we're in a situation where this is all very new. And as you say, there's a lot of words out there, and people are trying to work out what it means. I think there is a reaction in some parts of the world to this. For example, Australia is not associating itself with Idai-Lu, One Belt, One Road, because it feels that this is an attempt by China to impose a Sino-centric order on the world. Now, you might think that's laughable. Many of us do. And even if China wanted to impose a Sino-centric order on the world, it's not going to be able to do it, as we saw this week with President Modi and Prime Minister Abe signing an agreement for for Japan to build India's first high-speed rail. This is a clear message that some parts of the world will push back on this. That is as it's to be expected. But I think one of the best examples of concrete major power diplomacy by China was the creation of the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. I think this was a remarkable step by China, because all of the things that the AIB would do, building infrastructure, recycling Chinese surplus foreign exchange reserves, China could have done it by itself, unilaterally. And it is doing it in many countries by itself, unilaterally. But with the creation of the AIIB, what China has done is imposed upon itself multilateral rules and disciplines to limit and constrain China's action. It is part of a new world order, a new world architecture that China is, as a major power, starting to build block by block. And I think these are the concrete examples that really need to be highlighted and understood properly.
Yeah. What is the difference, though, between China's concept of a major country diplomacy from the United States diplomacy? How do you compare these two?
Well, you have to talk about whether it's pre-Trump or current Trump or post-Trump. And I think Trump is just an aberration, a blip. I don't think he represents American voters' thinking or Americans' thinking generally, but we're stuck with him.
Yeah, what has been the U.S.'s diplomatic philosophy, let's say?
Well, I think heretofore it's been muscular and aggressive, interventionist. And you look at, for example, the Iraq War, which everybody sees as a mistake now. I think everybody sees it that way. But now we have a president who wants America first, so it may be changing. We don't know, because the president's also made some bellicose statements about North Korea. So we honestly, we don't know where we stand at the moment. But I think that China is for win-win. Obviously, there's benefit to China, as there should be for all the parties that are involved. And I also think that the One Belt, One Road, Belt and Road Initiative, as it's called now, was a brilliant stroke, because it was announced in 2013, the world has changed so much since then. How could President Xi Jinping have known or anticipated these changes of Brexit, of Trump, and so on? But here we have it. I think for Belt and Road, though, we're going to have to wait and see how the various parties cooperate with China. I'm a little bit worried about the fact that China's workers in some of these Belt and Road countries are not getting good reviews, and that China's soft power is being damaged in those countries. So I think this is very much a work in progress, but I think it's a brilliant initiative and should be seen as such.
China's position, if no big disruption happens, China's position is going to continue to rise. We are going to see the unfolding of the Brexit saga, and we go into further chaos, let's say, of the U.S.'s administration. What kind of opportunity is there for China to better exemplify, to better demonstrate its major country diplomacy? Ambassador Raby.
Well, Foreign Minister Wang Yi, in that statement, I think he was saying that China will behave and act like a great power, but it will behave in a way different than previous great powers. And I think Victor, we expressed what Victor said somewhat differently, that the US has a view of its own exceptionalism. And US exceptionalism has meant that in US foreign policy, it's felt that not only its opportunity, but its obligation, its right, its mission to impose its values on the rest of the world. Now, countries that ascribe to those values, like Australia, are very comfortable with that worldview, but the world is different, and I think China is saying that this is a new period in world history. So, with that basis, I think there are lots of opportunities. Obviously, developing Lu more perfectly, spreading it more, deepening it, is obviously a major opportunity. I think multilateral institutional building, as I said, like the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, also is a very good guide to what can be done in future. And it will be a world that's going to need a lot more leadership. And particularly, I think, in the economic space, China has enormous opportunity to start to reshape more fundamentally the major international economic architecture.
When you become more capable, you have to show the greater responsibility, and that is called leadership. How China is going to handle that. That is the question we'll be all following closely over the next period of couple of years. But time is limited. We have to leave it there. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Ambassador Raby, former Australian ambassador to China, Victor Gao, interpreter for late Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping, and Harvey Zoding, a non-resident research fellow of the Center for China and Globalization. And with that, we come to the end of this special roundtable edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. As always, follow me on Twitter or Facebook using the handle The Point with LX. Download the application called CGTN Live, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks for watching. You've got The Point. Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thanks.